Well, let's take a look now at one of the key players in the conflict, the United States. And to discuss that, we can speak to Jonathan Schanzer. He's from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Well, as we've been hearing, the United States has blocked that effort by the United Nations Security Council to put out a statement condemning the violence and what's been going on. What role do you see Washington playing in this conflict?
I think Washington's role right now is somewhat muted. I think they've sent a rather low-level emissary, Hadi Amr, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State dealing with Middle East affairs. I think he lacks the stature to be able to engage directly with a lot of the senior people in Israel. He did meet with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who I would say is really not playing a significant role in this conflict himself. So I think the administration has provided some cover for the Israelis, at least for now, in terms of blocking this measure at the United Nations. They appear to be giving the Israelis a little bit more time to wrap up this operation, to be able to, in the Israeli hopes, to be able to decapitate some of Hamas's senior leaders and take out additional rocket stores so that they could degrade Hamas's capabilities for the longer term, rather than having something like this erupt yet again in another 3 or 4 years, which is too often the case.
Well, we know that the United States is Israel's closest ally, but a lot of people listening to this and our previous guests might think, well, why is the United States blocking this when it's so easy to put out those words of condemnation?
Well, I'm not sure that Israel is worthy of condemnation in this case. The war that has erupted with Hamas was launched by Hamas. In other words, there was a dispute that was taking place in Jerusalem that had nothing to do with Gaza. Hamas decided to begin firing rockets. Many of those rockets, or almost all of them, have been provided by Iran. This is a proxy war, in fact, by Iran against Israel. It was provoked needlessly, and now Israel is responding as I think any country would around the world if they had been fired upon, with thousands of rockets. 3,000 rockets have been fired into Israel. Israel has responded with surgical strikes. Yes, there has been lamentable loss of life and damage to property, but I have to say, in my experience of watching this conflict for the last 20-plus years, the damage has been minimal. The conflict has been contained, and from all indications, Israel has been operating as a very responsible military in the face of an onslaught by a state sponsor of terrorism.
You call it state-sponsored terrorism, and, we've seen some of the pictures here. We've been talking about this for the last week. Do you not feel, as our previous guest suggested, that Israel's response has been disproportionate?
I hear that often, and I think disproportionate is a nod to the number of deaths. And I would say that the number of deaths in Israel would be just astronomically higher were it not for the fact that Israel is able to shoot down a large majority of the rockets fired by Hamas. Their intention in firing into civilian areas is to kill as many Israelis as possible. Iron Dome is a remarkable technology that has prevented the loss of life that Hamas intended. And Israel, I think, is fighting this war with the full understanding that the intent was to kill thousands of Israelis and is responding to Hamas in kind. We're talking about an asymmetrical war, a war that is being carried out by a non-state actor sponsored by Iran in an attempt to really turn Israel into Seoul. In other words, to try to use the tactics that North Korea has used, where they could saturate and carpet bomb a country. Israel has, I think, done a miraculous job in preventing that in its own country, and then in turn responding surgically again to Hamas attacks.
Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, that think tank based there in Washington, D.C. Thanks for taking time to speak to us on the programme.